All right, so we are finally at level 1 for GCO9, and we are going to be learning about different theorems and postulates related to intersecting lines. So something we haven't learned about yet is theorems. A theorem is something that you need to prove. Postulates we don't prove, we can explain them, but we're not going to prove them. Postulates are just known facts, whereas theorems are some things that mathematicians recognized, but they were not exactly accepted to be true, so they needed to prove them to be true in order for people to say, okay, yeah, like I guess that does work. So all of these theorems that we're learning, they needed to be proved true in order for people to widely accept them. And some of them we will actually prove ourselves. So, vertical angles. These are two angles that are vertical from each other. They are created by intersecting lines. So for example, if I had this line here, and as a line that's going through that line, not necessarily perpendicular, but it intersects. A pair of vertical angles would be something like this angle here, angle 1, and angle 2. They are directly across from each other. And vertical angles are congruent. So we would say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Let me rewrite that congruent symbol for you. So this is an example of vertical angles. Linear pairs. What a linear pair is they're formed by two intersecting lines as well. So maybe we have similar lines to what we drew in the first diagram. But this time, a linear pair is angles that are right next to each other that create a straight line. So angle 1 and angle 2 here would be considered a linear pair, because they are right next to each other, they're connected, and they create this straight line right here that I'm highlighting in green. A linear pair, they are supplementary angles. So we would say that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. Meaning that they added together would have a sum of 180 degrees. Now, the congruent supplements theorem states that if we have two angles that are supplementary to the same angle, then those two angles would be congruent. For example, if I had angle 1 and angle 2 supplementary, and I had angle 1 and angle 3 are supplementary, then what we can conclude from this information is that angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent. It kind of makes sense because, for example, let's say that I said angle 1 was 10 degrees. That would make angle 2 170 degrees. Angle 1 is still 10 degrees, so angle 3 would also be 170 degrees. And since both angle 2 and angle 3 are 170 degrees, that means that they're congruent to each other. This is called the congruent supplements theorem. And the congruent complements theorem is basically the same thing, only this time you're given two angles complementary to the same angle instead of supplementary. So we could say angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary. And let's say angle 1 and angle 3 are complementary. If we were given that information, we could then conclude that angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent by the congruent complements theorem. Because, for example, again, let's say angle 1 is 10 degrees. That means that angle 2 and 3 would both have to be 80 degrees. And since they're both 80 degrees, that means they're congruent to each other. So this is the congruent supplements and complements theorem. If you know one of them, you'll know the other. And then the right angle congruence theorem, yes, this is something that was not accepted to be true, but all right angles are congruent. Somebody had to prove this theorem, that all right angles were congruent. So if you were given angle 1 is a right angle, and you were given angle 2 is a right angle, by the right angle congruence theorem, we can conclude that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. Okay, so for each figure or description below, we're going to state the conclusion we can make and the theorem associated to the numbered angles. So number 1, there's many different conclusions that we can make. Let's actually make all the conclusions that we can conclude in number 1. I can say angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. This is by the vertical angles theorem. Whoops. I can also say that angle 1 and 2 are supplementary. Oops. And that's by the linear pair theorem. Sorry, I did not give you a whole lot of room to write. I can also say angle 2 and 3 are supplementary by the linear pair theorem. And since I know that angle 1 and angle 2 and angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary, so angle 2 is both supplementary to angle 1 and 3, I can also say that angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent by the congruent supplements theorem. So the first statement can, there's multiple things that I can, or multiple reasons of why I can say angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. So number 2, there's a couple of different things you can say here as well. You can say, since angle 1's a right angle and angle 2's a right angle 1 is congruent to angle 2 by the right angle congruence theorem. A more generalized thing that you can say, which could maybe help you in a proof, is that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary by the linear pair theorem. All right, number 3 is a description. I have angle 1 complementary to angle 4, and I also have angle 6 complementary to angle 4. So this would mean that angle 1 is congruent to angle 6 by the congruent complements theorem. And I'm abbreviating, and you can too. All right, number 4, the only thing that we can say about angle 1 and angle 2 is that they're supplementary by the linear pair theorem. In number 5, the only thing that I can say about angle 1 and angle 2 is that they're congruent by the vertical angles theorem. And then number 6, if I know angle 1 and angle 2 form a linear pair, and angle 2 and angle 3 form a linear pair, that would mean that they are angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary. So first you would need to say that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and angle 2 and angle 3 are supplementary by the linear pair theorem. That's all you could say first. But then, what if I asked you to go further? And I asked you, what can we conclude from this? Now we can conclude that since both angle 2 is supplementary to angle 1 and 3, that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 by the congruent supplements theorem. We would not be able to jump to the writing in blue without saying the writing in red. All right, that is our first level 1 lesson. Go ahead and continue to lesson 2.